Okay, hello everyone. How are you doing? Um, yeah, welcome to this class, online class. Um, as usual, I'll just be waiting for a few minutes and like 1 or 2 minutes for everybody to come and connect. And I should switch off my my mobile phone. I don't want to hear me speak while I'm teaching the class. Okay, that's fine. Right, I hope everybody's doing well. Um, hello, good morning. Right, just as an introduction to before we get into the lesson itself about WW1. Hello, everybody. How are you doing? Right, there are plans. I've been told by Monsieur Verret that there are plans for you to go back to a class actually, and I've heard that the 1G1 will go back to some form of classes in high school, and so I've decided to maintain this. Whatever, because I think it's more it's easier for all of us to have a full class together, okay, on online classes instead of having like only 10 people only. So I will maintain this organization with online classes until the end of the year, I guess. Okay, good. So everybody, please be welcome. Welcome for the new people connecting. That's fine. Right. Just a short reminder of things we've said in what happened in the previous episode. So I spent some time trying to explain that World War One started due to complex factors, a variety of factors, including colonial tensions, colonial competition, but that did not lead to a direct war. The fact that many countries in Europe were developing fast and that their economy were becoming more and more competitive, and that there was a tension and a rivalry regarding industrialization and commerce and trade, and that led to some form of a rejection of the foreign countries that were more seen as competitors than partners. And finally, we also saw that there was a growing nationalism in Europe. The French willing to take revenge from the previous war, the Germans feeling that they had a role to play in Europe because they were becoming a major economic power. In the Balkans, many nations willing to be created like Serbia or Bosnia. And that all of this eventually led to one moment in 1914, one moment which I've already told you about, which is the moment when in Sarajevo in June 1914, the man who was supposed to succeed the Emperor of Austria, his name was Franz Ferdinand, was assassinated. And he was assassinated by people who were Serbian nationalists. So Austria declared war to Serbia, but Serbia was allied to Russia, and Austria was allied to Germany, and France and the UK were allied to Russia. And that was the spark. That was the spark that ignited everything. So this is the moment when it started, okay? And today, I'm going to move on. So that's why I'm in English, because I've told you that this part would be in English and the next one too. So part 2 and part 3 will be taught in English. We are supposed to study war and how it has affected European societies and to some extent American societies too. So I've decided to split my study in 3 parts. The first one is going to be a more military study, studying the different battlefronts and having some focus on specific moments in the war. So that's the military aspect and how far World War I changed the way of fighting. That's generally something you know well. You know about the trenches, you know about the new type of armament and so on. That's something you've studied in Troisième. I'm sure you remember this. But we need to focus on one specific battle. So either the Battle of the Somme or Gallipoli. I have chosen Gallipoli. I will insist on this British battle. Okay? The second part that I will try and start today, but let's be honest, I'm not sure I will be able to do that today, but anyway, is to see that World War I was a war of attrition. What does that mean? That after a few weeks or a few months, the war lasted much more than was planned originally. All European countries believed they were entering a short war. Few weeks, most of them, like 2, 3, 4, 6 weeks maximum. As you know, it lasted for globally 4 years and a half, from the summer of 1914 to autumn 1918, and actually in some countries like in the Balkans or in Turkey, it would last even a few more years, a month or years. What is attrition? Attrition is how you manage to exhaust your adversary. As you can't win due to your superiority on the battlefield, okay? You can't win due to the battlefield because there is a kind of balance of power. Then you have to make sure that the enemy eventually will run out of resources. This is what you call attrition, okay? So attrition is long-term exhaustion, right? Getting the enemy too weak, getting the enemy too powerless. It's not a military victory, it's a victory over the enemy's society. And so that means that the civilians played a major role in the war. And this is what the British call the home front. Hence my lesson today, the battlefront, where soldiers were fighting, the home front, where civilians and governments were making as much effort as possible to maintain the country in the war. Yes, you'll also call this the war effort. And I've decided to add a specific paragraph. I've decided to put a focus on 3 domains, 3 fields, or 3 categories for which there was a huge change due to the war. So I will do some focus on the position of women, because World War I gave women the right to vote in the USA or in the United Kingdom, not in France. I will also tell you a bit about how medicine was changed. Many huge improvements were made, and I will insist on how medicine and surgery managed to repair the faces of soldiers who had been disfigured by the war. And I will also insist on another element which the Australians called mateship, and that's the type of manly friendship that you can find in the battlefield. The fact that for many soldiers it was an experience, which of course many of them died in it and many of them were wounded in this war. But for many men, it also created a specific feeling of, a solidarity between men, something manly, something about power and violence. And that would be, and I'm telling you this because a very famous historian called George Mouse said that this feeling was one reason why the fascist parties or the Nazi party managed to recruit young men. Because these young men had experienced some form of male solidarity that they would also find in the different groups that the fascists or the Nazis managed to create. So I will show you why we can establish a link. Okay, that's it. So that's for today and next Monday and next Friday, right? That's going to be one hour approximately for each topic. Right? That's fine? Are there some questions? Do you have some questions about this plan, or it's clear? So today it's more a military approach, and this military approach is a war on many fronts, right? Movement, trenches, air and sea battles. And I will focus mostly on the Battle of Gallipoli, right? Good. Now, this is where we should start, of course, just to make sure that everybody's got a correct knowledge and correct vision of the situation in Europe between 1914 and 1918. And I will focus on the global aspect of the war later on. Actually, in Europe, very quickly, there would be 3 fronts. In Europe, there would be 3 fronts. The Western Front, and you can see it there like Verdun, La Somme, La Marne. These were the major battles. That's the Western Front. And mostly the Western Front is between France and the UK on the one hand, and Germany opposite. There was a second front, which was the Eastern Front, and that's where Russia was fighting. You can see it on the right-hand side of the map, where Russia was fighting, and that was globally against Germany and the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. And finally, in 1915, a new front would open, which is the Balkanic Front, or the Balkans Front. And this is where, in 1915, the Battle of Gallipoli would take place. So if you look at on the map, on the bottom right-hand corner, you can see a place called Les Dardanelles, the Dardanelles Strait, and this is where we'll be going in a few minutes. So, the reason for all these fronts to exist was firstly because, of course, you had these alliances in Europe. If you remember, I hope you do, you had the Triple Entente, you can say it in French because that's the way it was called, between the UK, France and Russia. You had the Triple Alliance with the Germans, the Austrians and the Ottomans. Okay? And so the very fact that you had these continental alliances made the war immediately on a European scale, starting on a European scale from the very beginning. Okay? Right. More precisely, in the very beginning of the war, that is August, September, October, November, okay, between the summer and the fall of 1914, the war was mostly what you call a movement war. I'm sure you know this. That's why I'm doing this very quickly, because I'm sure you all know this. What is the movement war? The movement war means that armies were moving very fast, so they would crush the adversary. So they would crush the enemy. So it was based on moving armies very quickly, very efficiently, so the enemy could not retaliate, could not respond, and would be defeated. As you may know, I'm sure you do, this strategy failed everywhere. It means that there was not a single place where actually an army was so defeated that it had to leave the war. A good example you have is what you call the Battle of the Marne. Bataille de la Marne. Why? Okay, just sorry. Trying to zoom in. Okay. War between France and Germany officially was declared in July, in August, my bad, in early August. As you can see it on the map, if you look at le Front de l'Ouest, the Western Front, 1 month later, 1 month after the true beginning of the war, the German forces were coming very close to Paris. Okay? There was a moment when the German army was less than 100 kilometers away from Paris. Right? Why? Because the German army had moved through Belgium, and Belgium was supposed to be a neutral country. Okay? So Germany broke the neutrality of Belgium, and they moved very close to Paris. If the German army had managed to take Paris, certainly the war would have been over very quickly. But the French armies moved very fast, and they managed to reorganize to block the German advance, as you can see. Okay, you can see, kind of crown on the map, with spikes. You see them, okay? And that's where the German offensive, the German advance was blocked. Right? Okay. So that's exactly what you call the movement war. Okay, armies moving very fast or as fast as possible, so that they could win definitive victories, and that did not happen. Actually, not in 1940. Right? If you look at the Eastern Front, you can see that the same more or less happened with a battle called Tannenberg, okay, where the Russian army managed to cross the German border, okay, and the Germans managed to stop the Russian advance in Tannenberg, and then they pushed them back. So Tannenberg in the east and the Battle of the Marne in the west are the same type of battles. Army is moving fast, and the country that was invaded resisting by moving its army fast too. And as you know, this changed the war. Why? It changed the war. So maybe you can write this if you want to take a few notes. Sorry for this. I'm just writing a few words for you to take notes. So that's it. So phase 1, what you call the movement war, and globally there was, depending on where you were staying in Europe, okay, this first movement war lasted from until November 1914 approximately, or spring of 1915, if you really want to go there. And what happened then was called a stalemate. And that's a word, maybe you don't know it. If you do, it's fine. But what happened next was something called a stalemate. And a stalemate means that the situation is blocked. Okay? The stalemate, that's a military word, but it's also, it's a common word. When a situation is totally blocked, you have reached a stalemate. That's called to reach a stalemate. And that means that the situation is stabilized. Okay? Right? Why was the situation stabilized? Because actually the Russians on the one hand, the French on the other hand, Austrians, Germans were not able to gain any decisive victory. Okay? This is where, look at the map, this is where the British decided to open a new front. And this new front would be opened in the Mediterranean Sea through Greece. And the aim was to cut the Ottoman Empire. The aim was to cut the Ottoman Empire from the Germans and the Austrians who were their allies. So the aim was to open a third front. And this is when the Battle of Gallipoli happened. So I'm going to move on. So we agree with this? 1914, Battle of the Marne in France, Battle of Tannenberg in Germany. Both battles were here to obtain definitive victories over the adversary. Both failed. It means that the Battle of the Marne managed to save Paris and the Battle of Tannenberg managed to save Germany from the Russian invasion. So there was a stalemate. 1915, decision was made to break, or try and break, it didn't work, to try and break the stalemate by opening a third front in Gallipoli. And in Gallipoli, the British would cope with the Ottomans, with the Turks. Let me show you. Sorry. My bad. It's not working. Good. Okay. Okay. I'm going to show you right now. I'm going to show you an extract from an Australian movie. This Australian movie was released, I guess, in the early 1980s. And it's called Gallipoli. Gallipoli. I will write the name and it's on your plan, you can see it. Gallipoli is a major turning point in the war, and I will explain you why in a few seconds. And the reason I'm going to show you an extract from an Australian movie, it's because many people who fought in Gallipoli as the British Army were actually Australians. There were people coming from Australia who felt they had to help the UK win this war because they still felt British to some extent. So Gallipoli was a major battle in Europe fought by Australian soldiers and soldiers from New Zealand and India too. Okay, so let me show you this extract right now. Okay, so right. So what you've just watched is an extract from this movie, so Gallipoli. Let me explain you what it's all about. So you can see the name Gallipoli on this map. As you can see, Gallipoli is right in the center between Greece and Turkey, or the Ottoman Empire. More precisely, maybe I've got a more accurate map to show you. Gallipoli is a peninsula. It's a peninsula which is facing, right, which is in the west of Turkey, okay. And if you look at the map I've just projected, Gallipoli is the spike of a peninsula that enables you to occupy or land on the Ottoman Empire. Okay? So that's where Gallipoli is. In the extract you've just watched, something has already changed compared to the first month of the war. You certainly saw that the British soldiers, or Australian soldiers in that case, were in trenches. Trenches had been dug in Gallipoli, and that proved that there was beginning to be a change in the war. The first month of the war were a movement war, consisted in a movement war. When the Gallipoli battle started, armies had started already digging trenches. Okay? Another document I want to show you. Sorry. Oh my goodness, I'm looking for it. Okay. Right. What was Gallipoli about? What was Gallipoli about? Right, look at this. So that's a map of Gallipoli. And on the map you can see something called the Dardanelles, right? That's a strait. And a strait is a short maritime pathway between two continental masses. Okay? So that's a strait. It's a very narrow maritime pathway. The British decided to attack the Ottoman Empire from here by trying to cross the Dardanelles. But as you can see on the map, with these little black signs, the Dardanelles Straits had been mined all the way. So when the British boats arrived, they exploded from the mines and they were bombed by the Turkish army. So it was decided not to try and break through the Dardanelles, but instead it was decided to land in Gallipoli. So instead of crossing the Dardanelles with boats, it was decided that soldiers should land on the continent. Okay? So what is interesting here is that you've got a military operation that consisted in both sea operations and land operations. Okay? There was no air operation at that time. So, as you can see on the map, if you look at the top of the map, you can read the letters ANZAC, A-N-Z-A-C. That means Australian and New Zealand Army Corps. It means that the British Army, the Commonwealth Army, consisted in Australians and New Zealanders. Okay? So they decided that they should land there. Problem, this is where they landed. This is where they landed. That's Gallipoli at that time. Sorry. Yes, that's it. That's a photo of Gallipoli at that time. I'm sorry for this. I should reduce it more. Okay. I'm sure you can see the problem. The problem is that they landed on this small, it's called a cove. Okay, it's a cove. So it's like, a circular form where the sea enters. It's a cove, like a bay, if you want. You see in the background, you see the hills. In the extract of the movie you've just seen, this is where the Turks were hiding. I'm sure you've seen in the extract, you can see the Turks using their machine guns hidden behind rocks. That's exactly where it was taking place. It means that the Australians were trying to gain, these hills and mountains, with the Turks waiting for them at the top. So, as you've seen in the extract, it was a massacre. It was a massacre. Because I'm sure you've noticed it. The Australians had no uniforms. I mean, they had uniforms. They were all dressed the same, but globally they were dressed like, farmers. They just had a light hat on their heads. No helmets. They had only rifles where the Turks had machine guns. So Gallipoli is interesting because it is remembered in the UK as one of the worst disasters in the history of the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth. Because the operation was very badly prepared. It was one of the worst operations in terms of preparation in the history of the UK military operations. Why? Why is that? Okay, let me show you a few testimonies about this. Right. Sorry, I'm just looking for... I'm sorry for this. I'm looking for one document. And I can find the proper one. It's coming. Okay. Here we go. Right. I love this one. You will see why. Okay, sorry. I'm going to get rid of all these useless documents so we can see better. Right. Look at the last paragraph. So, as you can see, thousands of men, thousands of British Army consisting in Australians and New Zealanders landed in Gallipoli. And you know what? They discovered how mountainous and hilly Gallipoli was only when they went there. They didn't know much about the landscape, for example. Look at the last paragraph. Hamilton was the man in charge of the operation, right? Hamilton only information, only intelligence consisted of a 1912 manual on the Turkish army, some old and inaccurate maps, a tourist guidebook, and what little could be gleaned could be caught from the Turkish desk at the Foreign Office. In these 3 lines, what do you learn? You learn that actually the British officers knew almost nothing about the place where they were going to land. Why didn't they know anything? Because, as I've told you at the beginning of this class, the war was supposed to be very short. No one had planned that a front should open in Turkey. No one had planned before that a landing could have taken in Turkey. No one thought that Australian soldiers would be needed in the war, because normally if the war had lasted for 1 month, no Australians would have come to Europe, because at that time it took maybe more than 1 month to come from Australia to Europe. Everything in Gallipoli happened because it was improvised. It was improvised because the war was not supposed to last for long, and military operations were decided, one after the other with no general strategy. Or I should say, maybe a general strategy, but no efficient tactics. Okay? Right, sorry, I'm just checking if there are some... No, there are no questions. Is that clear, what I'm saying about Gallipoli? Have you understood what I was trying to prove you? So, Gallipoli, and more generally the Dardanelles operation, I said was a disaster. Look at this. Look at this. This is the total amount. This is the total amount of casualties in Gallipoli. Okay? And casualties means the dead, the wounded, the dead, the wounded, and those missing in action, right? MIA, missing in action. Sorry. We are talking of an operation that lasted for a bit less than 1 year. It lasted for 11 months. Okay? The dates are March 1915 to January 1916. Okay, March 1915, January 1916. Yes. Just for this battle, which proved to be a disaster and a defeat for the British, 130,000 people died in one battle, in one place. 130,000 people died. As you can see, the Ottomans lost 86,000 just by defending their places, and the Allies lost 44,000. Twice as many were wounded. You can see it, right? If you multiply more or less by 2 the amount of dead, you will have the amount of wounded. What does that mean? That Gallipoli cost 400,000 soldiers. 400,000 soldiers were out of conflict, dead, wounded, or missing. Okay? In this battle. You can also see that soldiers from the UK, from France, Australia, New Zealand, India, Newfoundland, that's in Canada, were fighting. Now, you take these 400,000 soldiers in one battle, and you multiply by the number of battles that took place in various places in Europe, and you can understand why, in the end, World War I killed 9 million people. What I want you to understand, and maybe I can show you another document to understand this. It's coming, right? But I want to show you something, and I can't find it once again, which is a bit boring. Okay, it's coming. I'm sorry for all this, right? I don't know why I can't find this. Okay. It's coming. I'm really sorry. I had planned a document and it has disappeared. Okay, yeah, that's the one. What did all these people die from? I'm sorry, that's what I wanted to tell you. What did all these people die from? So, of course, they died from the confrontation. They died from rifle versus machine guns. They died from the shellings, the bombings, and so on. They also died from something else. I've told you everything was improvised, right? I've told you nothing was prepared. Let me give you another example of how nothing was prepared and to what extent nothing was prepared. Disease dominated the whole situation. That's from the Australian Medical Services, right? The latrines, the toilets were continually thronged with men, so that attempts at covering or disinfecting excreta became a farce. Black swarms of flies carried infection worm from the very bowel to the food as it passed the lips. To say differently, there were no toilets in sufficient amount for the soldiers. It means that very soon the trenches became the place where they fought, the place where they went to the toilets, where they liberated themselves, the place where they had dinner and lunch, the place where they slept. It was not only a lack of preparation in terms of military fighting, it was also a lack of preparation in terms of supplies, in terms of medical care. Many soldiers died because they could not be evacuated fast enough. And that was due to the fact that the battle was very early in the war. I've told you it started in March 1915. This type of mistakes would not happen in 1917 or 18 because now the countries were ready to have their, sanitary organization planned. So, for all these reasons, Gallipoli symbolizes the early moments of the war. Just after the movement war, there was the trench war, a third front was open, but much of it was improvised because at first the war was not supposed to remain for so long. Okay? And of course, in the second part, we'll see how societies organize to maintain the war effort for so long. Okay? Is that clear for you, what happened in Gallipoli and why it was a failure for the British? If some of you have been to Australia or if you intend to go, Gallipoli is highly memorized in Australia, and there is a holiday called Anzac Day, which commemorates. It's a holiday which commemorates the sacrifice of thousands of Australian soldiers in Gallipoli. Okay, right. Now, after 1915, a second phase started, and this second phase is what you call the trench warfare. Okay, and the trench warfare is sorry. Okay. My bad. The trench warfare, second phase, okay? Phase 1, the movement war. Second phase, the trench warfare. Because, as you can see, after the Battle of the Marne in France, the front line stabilized. I've told you this. It's called a stalemate. And so, as the front line stabilized, then the position of the armies stabilized. And the soldiers, little by little, and the armies started keeping their position by digging trenches. Just to show you how improvised it was at first too, I would like to show you an interesting document, which is really one of the documents I prefer studying when I teach this lesson, and you will understand why immediately, I'm sure. Okay, look at this. That's an advertising, right? It was published in British newspapers, and you can see that this advertising is for cigarettes in a brand of cigarettes called Golden Dawn cigarettes. It's advertising, okay? So the date is interesting, 1915. And it's firstly interesting because you have a trench on this poster, because these were the original trenches. Okay? They were dug, improvised digging of the earth, of the battlefront, so they could hide from the enemy shootings. So, of course, it's advertising, which means that there were very few chances that they would have been so smiling so much, and you can see the guy looking at the horizon. I can tell you that if he had done this, he would have been killed in like 2 seconds. Just what is interesting is that it proves us with one thing. One thing is being proven by this. In 1915, the British public opinion knew that a new type of war had started, the trench war, because these men, they were already in a trench. And in the extract that you've seen about Gallipoli, you could see that trenches were already a bit higher, because the extract you've seen was supposed to take place more in the middle of the Gallipoli battle, like in the mid of 1915. So trenches had become a bit higher. Okay? Sure? Good. So, of course, I'll be back on this document in a few minutes when I will conclude about the new type of war. My bad. So, what did the trench warfare change? It actually changed 3 things. Firstly, it changed the experience of soldiers. It changed the way soldiers in the war, especially British soldiers possibly, but French soldiers too, experienced the war. This is from 1917, so a bit later, right? And this is a testimony by a British soldier on the Western Front in Belgium. That's in Belgium. And that's from a diary held and kept by a British soldier. Friday, 13th of July, 1917. It proved to be a bad day. At about 8 a.m., the Germans started shelling steadily. A shell is a sharp bomb, okay? It has this form, a shell. One shell landed in my trench, almost beside me, and did not burst. I felt a burning sensation just above my right knee and heard the man next to me retch and cough. I shouted, "Gas!" and quickly put on my respirator. The gas alarm immediately sounded, and as we were good at our gas drill, only 5 or 6 of my company were gassed. Captain Rowan and his men had put on respirators, but after wearing them for some time in the heat of the morning, and no attack developing, they thought the original warning had been false and no gas had been smelled. What they did not know was that this was mustard gas, had no smell, and a delayed action. The company trenches were saturated with the stuff. By nightfall, every officer and man was either dead or in hospital. Okay? So, what the trench warfare changed is that as you could not count on the superiority of your army in terms of, mass and in terms of, let's say, physical superiority, armament, the type of weapons used, had to adapt to the trench warfare. If now men were protected by the trenches and you could not shoot them with rifles, you would have to use other arms, shells and gas. Okay? And so, the first gas was used in 1915. And so you can see here men from the British Army wearing these gas masks. If you go to war museums, if you go to the Imperial War Museum in London, if you go to Historial de Péronne, which is in France, you will see such masks, actually. They're generally displayed in museums. Okay. And so you see it's on the Western Front in 1916. Right? That proved that I've told you that at first it was improvised, okay? Then, in 1915 and 1916, the armies from France, Germany, Britain, Austria, Russia adapted to the trench warfare. Now the trench warfare became the norm. So it means that you could not win by a massive superiority of your men, but that you would use armament adapted to this. If you go to Verdun today, so if you go to this place, this is called Douaumont, and Douaumont is next to Verdun. Actually, it's in front of Verdun, right? And in Douaumont, you had a fort, and this fort was heavily bombed by the Germans, heavily shelled by the Germans. And this is what it looks like today or a few years ago. It means that 100 years later, the place was so much shelled, the place was so much bombed, that you can still see holes 5 or 7 or 10 meters deep today. 1 century later, the holes made by the bombs, the holes made by the shells, can still be seen in the landscape. This is exactly what the trench warfare was looking like. Okay? It was a permanent storm of gas, permanent storm of shells, permanent storm of bombings. Okay? Right. As I've told you, armies were in a stalemate. They were keeping their position. As they were keeping their position, a new front opened, the Balkan front, the Dardanelles and so on. It didn't work neither. So what was the next step? The next step was to change the methods of warfare, change the methods of how countries would fight. And that would lead to this. That would lead, for example, to sea battles. Sea battles. On the map you have here, you can see 2 battles called the Jutland Battle and the Dogger Bank Battle. And what does that correspond to? If you look at the map, you can see 2 lines. Okay, there are 2 lines on the sea. One between Scotland and Norway. One between Scotland, you see Scotland, I hope, right? You see Mer du Nord, and just above there is a line, okay, between Scotland and Norway. And another line, which is between France and the UK, over the Channel Strait. This is what you call a maritime blockade. That's a maritime blockade. It means that the sea also was a place of confrontation. The aim was to stop Germany from being supplied, was to stop Germany from getting food from abroad, getting armament from abroad, getting materials from abroad. And that was done by the British as a retaliation, as a kind of reprisal against some things the Germans had done to the British population. Sorry, I'm just, doing some cleaning. Okay. This poster was released at the end of 1914 in the UK, in the United Kingdom. Okay, let's zoom. I'm sure you can see in the foreground, standing just before a house that has crumbled, there is a young girl, and she's holding a baby in her arms. And next to her, there is a bunch of crumbled stones, bricks that have fallen into ruins. And if you look more precisely, you can see that the house has been destroyed. And the reason it's been destroyed, it's because it has been bombed from above. This poster is referring to the Scarborough raid in my bad. That's it. In December 1914, the British city of Scarborough, which is in Yorkshire, so in northern England on the sea, was bombed by a German bombing from the air. Okay? 78 women and children were killed and 228 women and children were wounded by the German raiders. Plus, of course, in that case, a family was killed. Leaving 2 orphan children. Okay? And it means that the young girl will have to take care of her younger sister or brother, I don't know exactly. How did that happen? It happened because there was operation that started by Germany called Zeppelin bombings. I'm sorry, I don't know why I can't find the picture once again. It's all in disorder. Do you have it? No, you don't have it. I'm sorry, I'm just picking it. Here it is. I was in the wrong folder. Okay, that's it. This is a Zeppelin. Okay, so Zeppelin is an air device, okay, carrying passenger. I don't know if you can see that. So it's all full of helium, right, and hydrogen. And you can see there is a cabin. If you look at this, right, there is a passenger cabin. And so you could actually put soldiers or in this place, and you would drop bombs. At that time, it was not a modern bombing. Don't think of the modern planes which have missiles attached. Not at all. At that time, people would actually have grenades or bombs, and they would just drop them. And actually, the Zeppelin had an advantage, is that it was very silent. It was a silent device. And so the Germans did this. They bombed the British cities. So what does that mean? Let's summarize, because it's already, okay, it's noon. Yeah, more than noon, actually. What does that mean? Let's summarize. From the very first month of the war took place on the land, the trenches. In the sea blockade, the maritime blockade, or the landing in Gallipoli. And in the air, with the first bombings. For the first time in history, some cities were bombed from above. Not bombed from a distance, as it was already the case before, but bombed from above. Okay? So, to conclude on all this, when I say conclude, not fully conclude, but to conclude on a war on many fronts. The war started as a movement war. Then it turned into a trench warfare. The trenches were dug. But air and sea battles took place. So the Battle of Gallipoli, which is both a land and sea battle, the bombing of Scarborough, which was an air bombing, and so on. Okay? So now there is one last thing we've not said. And that's going to be my last point for today. There is a reason it's called World War I. And the reason it's called World War I, it's because what started as a European war turned into a global war. And the reason for this is that the Atlantic Ocean became a place for confrontation. The Atlantic Ocean became a place for confrontation. Why? Because sorry for this. Okay. During the war, the French and the British were doing a lot of trade with the United States, but it happened that the United States had remained neutral in the war. When the war started in Europe in 1914, the USA had remained neutral, and there were many reasons for this. I give you the reasons. The first reasons for the USA to remain neutral is that it was their official doctrine at the time. Their official doctrine was called isolationism, and that means we are not involved in the European affairs. Europeans deal with European affairs, Americans deal with American affairs, and there should be no interfering between both. Isolationism. Secondly, I'm sure you know this, the American society, the US society, is a society of immigrants. It was built by various waves of people coming to the USA, and these people were from British ascendancy, French ascendancy, German ascendancy, Austrian ascendancy, Russian, and so on. And so, if the USA entered war on one side, there was a risk of civil tensions, between communities in the USA. So the US President Wilson said, we won't enter war. The third reason is that actually in the beginning of the war, the USA were not sure who was responsible for the war. I mean, everybody had a responsibility in the war, as I've told you. Everything changed in 1915. Why? You can see it on the map. Because an American boat called the Lusitania was sunk, was torpedoed by a German submarine. What does that mean? It means that the Lusitania was carrying passenger, from the USA to Europe. But the Germans were using submarines, and they thought that this Lusitania was also bringing supply to France and the UK. So they sent a torpedo, which is a submarine missile, if you prefer, a submarine rocket, a torpedo, and the Lusitania sank. The Lusitania sank. And it was a huge shock in the USA. This is the New York Times cover page from the day after the Lusitania was sunk. It was in May 1915. Lusitania sunk by a submarine, probably 1,000 dead, twice torpedoed off Irish coast, 6 sinks in 15 minutes. Washington believed that a grave crisis is at hand. Why? Because it means that American civilians had been killed by a German attack. From that moment, the relations between the USA and Germany degraded, and in April 1917, the USA declared war to Germany and intervened on the European front. Okay? So, what does that mean? It means that, I'm sorry for this, okay, get through this. What does that mean? It means that in 1917, the war was truly a world war. Okay? It was truly a world war because America had joined, but also if you look at this map, sorry, it's here again. If you look at this map, colonies, the French colonies in Africa, the British colonies in Africa or in India were fighting. I've just told you a few minutes ago that Australians and New Zealanders sent soldiers to Europe. Okay? In the end, look at this. In the end, even Brazil joined the war. Why did Brazil join the war? Because Brazil was a close ally to the USA, and so when the USA joined the war, there was an American, contamination, if you want. Okay? Right. So, to put all this in a nutshell, you still have no questions. I can't see any question coming, so either... Ah, there is one. Sorry, I'm just summarizing this. You say trenches changed the war in 3 ways. Can you sum them up? Okay. So, firstly, you ready with this? The first thing is that when you fight in the trenches, you rely more on the armament, on the weapons, than on the amount of soldiers you have. Because in trenches, soldiers, they hide or they can find shelter. So you need to adapt your armament. So trenches, that means that armament would adapt. Using gas, for example. Using gas is a way to force the people out of trenches. Firstly. Secondly, because it created it forced the army to stabilize on their position. Trenches were dug because there was a stalemate, and so the trenches forced the armies to stabilize their positions. And so it participated to making the war longer. Okay? Finally, final change. It created a specific experience for soldiers, which is the one we've read with the soldiers, everybody was dying with gas and so on. I mean, death is everywhere in trenches. Okay, let me show you this. I skipped this document, but I can show it to you. This is a trench in Verdun. A few months after the end of the war. So it's 1918 or 19, possibly, certainly 1919. The Verdun battle had taken place 3 years before. And this is a trench. What does that mean? It means that bodies remain there. No one was able to bury these bodies properly, because people were dying so fast. Men were dying so fast in the trenches that actually bodies would decompose on location. Okay, so the third thing that trenches change is that death was everywhere and that you were surrounded by it without being able to move. What I mean is that all battles in wars are bloody, you know what I mean? There's no such thing as a clean war. But when it's a position, when it's a movement war, you lose men and you advance or you move, and so you don't stay on the same place. So even if people were killed, you don't have to live among them. In the trenches, you had to live with the dead bodies. You had to live with the blood. You had to live with the mud. You had to live with the excrements. You had to live with the rats. You had to live with the vision of blood and death everywhere. And that was an experience that also changed the societies perceived the war. Okay? I hope I've answered your question, Theo. Okay? Good. I mean, good. I'm not sure it's the proper word, but anyway. Just to illustrate it in the very same way, right? That's it. This is what a battlefield looked like after a confrontation. When soldiers were trying to get out of the trenches, and they would be, mowed down. Exactly what you've seen in the extract of the movie, you see? In Gallipoli, the extract of their movie, you can see people, they get out of the trench and they're immediately mowed down. They're immediately shot down. That's absolutely true. The film is very realistic about this. Even though it's a film, I mean, it's a fictional movie, but the situation in trenches was actually like this. Okay? And you can see the field of destruction all around, right? You can see there is, no more trees and vegetation totally gone, and all these bodies lying on the ground, on the floor. It's not a floor. This is also something that changed the experience of soldiers. Okay? Okay, right. I have to possibly conclude. Let me show you one last thing. Okay. Right. On the left-hand side, the reality. On the left-hand side, a photo showing the reality of what the trench warfare and the battlefield, how it was actually. On the right-hand side, advertising, okay? Time for one more, men having a good laugh and a good smoke in a trench. The reality gap between the two documents is due to three things. Firstly, it's an advertising, so you want to sell something. So I'm not sure you would sell any cigarettes by showing a picture of, dead bodies everywhere. Secondly, 1915 was still a moment. 1915 was still a moment when maybe countries could hope for a quick a rather quick ending of the war. So you still could be not optimistic, but at least, not everybody was believing it would last for 3 or 4 more years. Thirdly, and that's going to be my transition for the second part, which I will deal with on Monday, because I'm going to stop right now, which I will deal with on Monday. This advertising was published in a British newspaper, which means that it actually went through the British government censorship. There was no way a picture like the one you've got on the left could have been published in a newspaper in 1915 in the UK, due to the fact that the state was more and more controlling the type of information that was spread. Okay? And so that's exactly what we will see. Well, all these curls and so on. This is exactly my bad. Okay, what will we see next time? Just one last look at the plan of the lesson, if you're okay with that. That's it. No. Oh, please. Why can't I project the... Okay. I'm not allowed to show it. I don't know why. Anyway, next time, don't worry about this. I'm over anyway. So, next time, next Monday. So remember, it has to be a bit earlier than usual. It will be at 8:30. I will deal with societies at war, the home front, how the civilians committed themselves and how the state encouraged the civilians to commit themselves into supporting the war effort. That means participating to the economy, censor, organizing the production, and also organize an ideological mobilization of the civilian society to keep fighting in the war. Okay? Are there any more questions on this? Are there any more questions on this? Are you okay? I can't remember what time it was. Was it 8:45? Maybe 8:45. Yeah, it must have been 8:45. 8:45 to 10. That's fine. 8:45 to 10. That's fine. Let's do this. Yes, we're going to study the Bolshevik Revolution, Theo. That's going to be in settling peace, the consequences of the war. I'm going to explain you quickly the Bolshevik Revolution. We need it because next year we have to study Stalin's Russia. So, okay? So see you on Monday, 8:45. That's fine. We can sleep 1/4 of an hour more. That's fine. Okay? See you on Monday. Bye-bye.